Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to a question which we considered in the early part of the semester, which is the question of democratic loyalty. It's the question of why citizens in a liberal democracy should even care about the survival of their institutions and the institutions and values of a liberal democracy. But we're also asking the question, what is needed as a practical matter, as an empirical matter, in order to strengthen and broaden the levels of support that exist for democracy in the United States and other Western democracies? What is needed to reinvigorate the idea of democratic loyalty or civic loyalty? We can define a liberal democracy, as we have throughout the semester, as a political system in which there are strong protections for the rights and liberties of all citizens, including minority groups, and which embody effective institutions of electoral representative democracy and equal rights of political participation. So our question is a relatively simple one. Supposing that this kind of political system is functioning as advertised, would citizens find these arrangements satisfying and fulfilling? And would they develop civic loyalty in their support? Are these institutions valued by the citizens who live in countries in which they are present? Now, there's a rather disappointing fact, which public opinion research and international public opinion research has demonstrated, and that is that public support for and also confidence in the institutions of liberal democracy has fallen dramatically in the past 20 years. A 2020 Pew Research study based on a 2019 Global Attitude Survey across many countries showed declining levels of satisfaction with democracies among citizens in numerous countries, with only 59% of US respondents who reported being not satisfied against 39% of US respondents who were satisfied. And the not satisfied numbers are comparable to or worse for France, Spain, Italy, United Kingdom, Bulgaria, and Greece. The highest levels of satisfaction, according to this survey, highest levels of satisfaction for democracy are found in Sweden at 72% satisfaction, the Netherlands 68%, Canada 66%, Poland 66%, and Germany 65%. So in the US in particular, with only 39% of respondents reporting that they are satisfied, this is a disturbing sign of the health of democracy in the United States. In 2017, this is quoting from the AAAS democracy documents, which you read for today, but quoting, a 2017 international study by the Pew Research Center on people's commitment to democracy revealed troubling news. 51% of US respondents described themselves as dissatisfied. Notice that in only 2 years, that number went from 51% to 59%, who in 2019 were dissatisfied, and 46% said that they were open to forms of government other than representative government, including rule by a strong leader or by a group of experts. That's very disturbing because that demonstrates a lack of investment in, a lack of loyalty to the institutions of a liberal democracy. Furthermore, for young people, the numbers are even worse. Quoting again, fewer than 1/3 of millennials consider it essential to live in a democracy. And yet, it would seem obvious that for the great majority of the population in the United States or Germany or UK, that the arrangements of a liberal democracy are very favorable. These institutions ensure substantial freedom, fair equality of opportunity if the institutions are working as they are advertised to work, and equal rights of political participation in public decision-making. These rights are substantive and they're very real components of political liberties. These circumstances of an effective liberal democracy would seem to be ideal for ordinary people who wish to fulfill themselves and to live satisfying lives. But we have seen throughout the course that there are individuals and groups who are not favorably inclined towards the premises of liberal democracy. There are those who favor dominance over racial, ethnic, or gender lines, those who believe in unconstrained inequalities, and those who want power to impose their ideological or moral beliefs on others as a matter of law. All of those views are inconsistent with the premises and the values and institutions of a liberal democracy. But this seems to demonstrate an answer to the question of the question which Rawls posed in the materials we read early in the semester, the question of whether a just society generates its own political psychology of support. What these data seem to suggest is that liberal democracy does not automatically generate the political psychology among its citizens that it needs for stability, at least not in an overwhelming majority of its citizens. Instead, maintaining the conditions of a liberal democracy is itself a problem of democratic politics and strategy. And very deliberate, conservative, anti-liberal politicians have been making the opposite case for several decades in the United States. Going back to Pat Buchanan during the Nixon years and then the decade following the Nixon years, politicians like Pat Buchanan expressed a fundamentally anti-democratic message to his followers. The undermining of confidence and faith in democratic institutions by the GOP and by Fox News did not begin in 2016. And the AAAS report that you read offers a strategy for regaining broad public support for democratic institutions. In other words, if support and loyalty to democratic institutions doesn't come about naturally, then we must struggle for it. We must undertake a political strategy to develop and encourage and cultivate the loyalty and support of our fellow citizens for the institutions of democracy. So the AAAS strategy involves a number of recommendations. They write, we have identified 6 imperatives at the heart of our findings. 1, to achieve equality of voice and representation through our political institutions. 2, to empower voters in a lasting way. 3, to ensure the responsiveness of our political institutions. 4, to dramatically expand the capacity of civil society organizations that foster bridging across lines of difference, across different communities, different race and religion communities, for example. 5, to build civic information architecture, i.e. social media, that supports common purpose. And finally, 6, to inspire a culture of commitment to American constitutional democracy and to one another. What's interesting about these recommendations, if we take them apart, is that at least the first 3 are addressed to the sources of dissatisfaction which populists have in the institutions of democracy. The idea that our voices don't really count, the idea that we don't really have power over the direction that our government takes, or the idea that our institutions will be conforming to the preferences of voters. Those are all claims which are made by right-wing populists, and these recommendations for strengthening democracy basically say we need to ensure that the promise of democracy is in fact upheld. And so parties, this is, I think, a conclusion we can draw from some of the analysis and findings of this course. Parties, civic organizations, politicians, and citizens who favor and desire the institutions of liberal democracy, we must therefore take an active role in building political consensus around our democratic institutions. These organizations, these pro-democracy organizations, must persuasively make the case to enough of the rest of the population to maintain broad, deep commitment to the values of constitutional protections of our rights and the institutional fairness of our electoral process. And this must be built through mobilization, communication, and leadership in ways that inspire millions of people to share this cause. these efforts must persuade other citizens to support the agenda of liberal democracy, which is not liberalism. It is the set of institutions I described at the beginning of the talk today, to support the agenda of liberal democracy and to resist the suasion of the illiberal, the anti-liberal, the anti-democratic parties, the authoritarians, and the hate-based parties. Here again, the AAAS study is relevant and consistent. This is why I asked you to read it. And it shares a sense of urgency, which I hope has come out of this course as well. Quoting from the AAAS study, "We have no time to waste. Our constitutional democracy is only as strong and resilient as our belief in it. For love of freedom and equality, for love of country, for love of one another, and out of hope for a better future, we need to reclaim our bond. If we turn back toward one another, we can transform our institutions, we can renovate our Constitution, we can elevate our culture, we can at last achieve a true democracy." These are hopeful words, and these are words which we need to think about very, very deeply and carefully at this time in November and December of 2020. The AAAS study advances an idea which we also saw in John Rawls, the idea that there is a virtuous cycle, a kind of self-affirming cycle between democratic institutions and democratic loyalty. The AAAS study of democracy reiterates this idea that democracy can work to generate a political psychology among citizens that it needs for its stability. Quoting from the study, "Consequently, a healthy constitutional democracy depends on a virtuous cycle in which responsive political institutions foster a healthy civic culture of participation and responsibility, while a healthy civic culture, a combination of values, norms, and narratives, keeps our political institutions responsive and inclusive." You can see how this idea about citizen motivation, citizen commitment, and civic institutions is expected to work, according to these advocates for a revitalized democracy. But there's an issue, there's a profound issue, a hugely important issue, which the AAAS study is not addressing. The pro-democracy arguments made in the AAAS study focus on the institutions of individual freedom and democratic participation. And this is what's involved in the idea of liberal political institutions. But notice what a deliberately narrow way this is of posing the question of the acceptability, the desirability of a set of institutions. It asks a question about the political institutions of the country, but it is silent about the economic and social institutions. Political justice, constitutional protections of rights and liberties, political justice by itself is probably insufficient to generate strong satisfaction and civic loyalty among the great majority of citizens. I offer that to you as a hypothesis. I think it's a hypothesis for which we've seen some evidence through our discussion of populism. What is it that is generating support for populism? Well, we've seen some pretty dark motives like racism, but there's also the fact of economic disempowerment. And in fact, it is perfectly clear that people care about economic justice and fairness as well as the political rights that they have in the institutions of electoral democracy. People are concerned about economic justice insofar as their own circumstances are perceived to be either fair or not fair. And many people would judge that a society is unjust if there is such a division between rich and poor that, in fact, the life prospects of the poor are dramatically worse than those of the rich. But it is pretty clear from economic data and from sociological data that American society and many other Western democracies, that American society has fallen behind on issues of economic justice, with rapidly rising inequalities between rich and poor, declining availability of middle-class jobs in an increasingly globalized economy, declining opportunities for social mobility, for people in the bottom 50 or 60% of the economic ladder, and continuing discrimination and disparity along racial, ethnic, or gender lines. So social and economic fairness is not assured in the Western democracies that we've been considering. We have already seen that dissatisfaction in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, or France is based on economic and social dissatisfaction rather than frustration with the system of individual rights and majoritarian government. We've seen, for example, in Just and Just, in The New Minority, that the marginalization and disaffection of white working class men and women in Youngstown and East London stem from social and economic causes, as well as frustration with the system of electoral politics in which they find themselves. And this suggests that we need to give consideration to the social and economic arrangements of a given liberal democracy if we want to understand the dynamics of citizen satisfaction. In fact, these are some of the factors that observers like Just and Jest have highlighted in the explanation of white working class disaffection within the existing order. And it is hard to see how broad civic loyalty or democratic loyalty can be rekindled unless there is a broader reality of social equality, equality of opportunity, and solidarity across all segments of society, which would allow for all members of society to believe that, quote, democracy and well-being are available for all of us. So protecting our liberal democracy means taking concrete, meaningful measures through legislation to increase the basic economic and social fairness of our market economy. And it's kind of clear what those legal measures might be. We might imagine a social democracy, a more just capitalist economy, in which we are able to articulate the requirements of fairness and justice within the economy. It would be a social economic system that limits the extent of inequalities of wealth and income. It would be a social economic system that succeeds in satisfying the basic human needs of all members of society: education, healthcare, access to decent housing. It would be a legal system providing strong guarantees of equality of opportunity and non-discrimination. It would be a system of law and regulation ensuring public health, well-being, and safety. And it would be a fiscal system or a system of taxation that suffices to ensure limitations on wealth and provisions of mandatory social services and benefits. This would be a social economic system and a legal system which would be closer to the ideal of a fair and just society in the Rawlsian conception. So we might consider a thought experiment. Those ideas that I just expressed about what a fair social democracy might look like, those statements address the dimensions of unfairness that many citizens are currently experiencing in Western democracies. And so we might imagine that a given democracy, France, let's say, has undertaken the social and economic and legal reforms that follow from these principles. And now we can ask our question again. Will most citizens develop civic loyalty or democratic loyalty to their political, social, economic system, embodying liberal protections of their freedoms and economic assurances of fair opportunities in social and economic life? Would the anti-democratic opposition to modern democracies be quenched? Would the anti-democratic populist impulse in modern democracies become once again a small minority position? And would the resulting society be a less fertile environment for right-wing extremism, radical populism, and hate-based political mobilization? Would this kind of political, social, economic system, in fact, possess the self-reinforcing characteristics of political psychology that Rawls expected when he wrote about the overlapping consensus and the bonds of justice? That's what the thought experiment is intended to make us consider. Is a liberal democracy more stable if it is also committed to being a just and fair democracy?